Well, thanks, Dan. It's great to be here. Great to see so many faces I recognize. And it's really a privilege for me to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund. Elaine is the Herbert S. Aubrey Chair in Social Sciences. She's a professor of sociology and director of the Boniek Institute for Religious Tolerance at Rice University. Over the past several years, Elaine's research has explored how scientists in different nations understand religion, ethics, and gender, religion at work, and the overlap between racial and religious discrimination in workplaces. Elaine has received funding for her research from the National Science Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, the Issachar Fund, the John Templeton Foundation, the Templeton Religion Trust, and the Templeton World Charities Foundation. She's the author with students and colleagues of over 100 journal articles and 7 books. And most recently, Elaine is co-directing a $2.9 million grant in order to create a new field of sociological research examining science and religion. That particular project I'm very excited about. Before Elaine comes up, I hope you'll indulge me for a moment because I'm going to out myself now in that I became first acquainted with Elaine's work as one of her research subjects. In her first large study, which was eventually published in 2010 in Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, from Oxford University Press. Elaine's study was unique in my own experience because it focused on religious preferences and practices of leading natural scientists in the United States. Elaine's findings confirmed some previous studies, I think, but with substantial added rigor. And I think more important to me as a research subject, it defied common stereotypes regarding international leaders in natural science and how they make sense of their religious lives. We scientists are far from a monolithic bunch, and I think you'll get that sense as Elaine does her presentation. Now, I happen to be a practicing Christian, which placed me in the minority in this study to be sure, but what impressed me about Elaine was that she sought to listen to the variegated experiences of all of the scientists that she interviewed through her extensive qualitative research as part of that project. And I was really struck by her sensitivity in seeking to draw us as scientists out about areas which were not traditionally want to do, areas about our interior lives. And I think through her countless interviews in Scientists versus Religion and her journal articles, that sense has been multiplied over and over as her research team has expanded as well. I think that same sensitivity came through in a converse perspective in a subsequent book, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think, in 2017, co-authored with Christopher Scheidel. And my second major interaction with Elaine was through a book that my colleague and eminent historian of science here at UW-Madison, Ron Numbers, along with Ron Binsley and myself, edited, which was published in 2018. And that was called The Warfare Between Science and Religion, The Idea That Wouldn't Die. Ron Numbers assembled an incredible group of historians, and my very small contribution to this project was to put them in dialogue with sociologists like Elaine, who are arguably, in my opinion, historians of the present moment. The conference and ultimately the book analyzed the simplistic but very, very persistent notion that science and religion are ineluctable enemies. Elaine and her team used this as an opportunity to extend their analysis of what scientists think about religion outside of North America, and that eventually led to another book, Secularity in Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion, in 2019. Elaine's latest book, this one, is Varieties of Atheism in Science, published in 2021, which she co-authored with, well, there it is, great, with David Johnson. This book tackles one of the largest pieces of the pie that really emerged from Elaine's original research, and that is scientists who identify themselves as atheists. And I use air quotes advisedly because one of the things that frustrates people of goodwill in the science and religion dialogue the most is a tendency that some have to paint atheists with a broad brush, assuming that a strident minority speaks for what, at least in my experience, has been the much more generous and I think richly varied majority of non-believing scientists. As you'll hear tonight, Elaine's research once again dispels facile binary thinking on this topic. The resulting picture corresponds, I think, much better with my own personal experience with my colleagues here at UW and elsewhere. It's my hope that our presentation will help all of us, whether we're believers or not, to appreciate the nuances and complexities of personal faith commitments among scientists. Please take this opportunity to join me in welcoming Dr. Elaine Howard Ecklund.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a really generous introduction. I am very, very humbled. I have been surprised about a lot of things in my research, and some things not very surprised about. So I'm a sociologist of religion, and sociologists are very interested in group behaviors. That's our raison d'etre. We take as a given that groups are something different and have their own identities above and beyond the constituent individuals that are part of those groups. And probably you, as even as those who are in the room who are not sociologists, have an intuitive understanding of that. So as a sociologist of religion who studies the variety of religious identities in the world, if you'd ask me if I thought scientists could have different types of religious identities, I would have thought, contrary to popular belief, that yes, there are probably scientists with different kinds of religious identities. There are lots of different ways of being religious. But if you had asked me if I thought that there could be many different ways of being an atheist scientist, I would have said absolutely not. That being an atheist by definition is to not believe in God. You know, there's one way of being an atheist scientist: you don't believe in God. And this is what I love about the research process, and I know many of you in this room are probably researchers, is that research really allows you to actually become a more humble person. There's a kind of virtue, I think, of being a researcher, that we quickly understand the limits of our own knowledge. And this is one way that I began quickly to understand the limits of my own knowledge. When I started doing studies of scientists who are religious and scientists who are not religious, and I realized that there is an incredible amount of variety of atheism in science, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And I want to acknowledge my co-author on this project, David Johnson, who is now an associate professor at Georgia State University. Worked as a postdoc with me during this project. We have already written some work from an 8-nation study that we did on scientists called Secularity in Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And then the second book is Varieties of Atheism in Science, as Jeff mentioned. So the views of atheists in the broader public are pretty complicated. Some historians of atheism have called atheists, in some ways, a much maligned minority. The percentage of those in the U.S. willing to vote for a party's well-qualified atheist candidate for president has gone up quite a bit, but it started out quite low in the 1950s. So while atheism has increased in its respectability in the American public, it started out very low. There also is a sense among atheists in the broader public that they really need to defend that they have the possibility of being moral people, because most in the general public connect morality and religion. You see this poster I put up, being a good person doesn't require a God. You don't believe in God, you're not alone, from the Free Thought Florida Society. And certainly there is the sense still among some that atheism means that one is disconnected from moral practice because morality means that one requires religion to be moral. In science, there is a deeply entrenched perspective that atheists in science are all like what some have called the new atheists. So this is quite a famous picture from a dialogue that resulted in this book by Hitchens, Dawkins, Harris, and Dennett, called The Atheist Revolution, The Four Horsemen. It's actually a really interesting piece, if you want to read it, that's about the dialogue that these four had with one another. And it's very, very popular for those in the general public to think that all atheist scientists are very much like Richard Dawkins, who has come out quite negatively against religious people. And I want to be very fair-minded to Dawkins. He has done amazing scientific work and has done, I think it has been a real interlocutor with the public about science and trying to convince the public of the importance of science in the world. But he certainly has led many religious people to believe that all atheist scientists are very much against them. So I want to go over several points tonight. So I want to help you understand that most atheist scientists are not atheists because of science. This is a really entrenched stereotype in faith communities. Secondly, I want to help you understand that modernist atheist scientists are not like the new atheists, and that's a category that we'll discuss. I want to help you understand that some atheist scientists are actually culturally religious, are embedded within religious communities, in marriages and partnerships with folks who are religious, send their children to religious schools. I want to help you understand those scientists who think of themselves as spiritual atheists, a category that my scientist respondents talked about quite a bit. And for those of you in the room who are persons of faith, who are committed Christians in particular, I want to try to help you understand that religious people, and Christians in particular, should give atheist scientists a chance. For those of you who geek out about these kinds of things, I want to talk to you a little bit about the methods of the study at a glance. For some of you, this may be too much, and for some of you, too little, so feel free to ask follow-up questions in the question and answer period. So this broader study involved 1,293 convinced atheist survey respondents. So we did studies of 8 countries of scientists, but then we pulled out just the convinced atheist respondents and analyzed that data separately from the whole to try to understand the nuances in the atheist scientist community. We also conducted in-depth interviews with 81 atheist scientists. So I don't know if probably most of you have taken a survey at some point in your life. Surveys necessarily box people in. Like, I, as the researcher, decide what the answer choices that you have are, whether or not those might be the answer choices that you would want. I decide based on what I know. I love always coupling surveys with in-depth interviews and observational work because when I interview people, then you create, as the respondent, you create the categories, right, in response to my questions. So we always have those two kinds of data on my team. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that we look specifically just at the US and UK, and I want to give you some demographic breakdown here. Interestingly, when comparing US and UK scientists, the same proportion were men and women. We didn't have very many non-binary people in this particular sample. When looking at the racial categorizations, most of the scientists are white, particularly in the UK, which makes some sense. Less than 1% of the convinced atheist scientists were black, about 24% Asian. In the US, that's mostly Asian internationals studying in the US or participating in science in the US, 8% in the UK. Those who identified as Hispanic ethnically are 7%, and other racial or ethnic groups were 2%. We also looked at scientists who are at different career stages, so we wanted to look at different cohorts of scientists. So This is the proportion of scientists who were either in training, our early career scientists, so postdoctoral fellows or assistant professors, and then more senior scientists who are fully tenured as associate professors and full professors. And then we also looked in particular at the disciplines of biology and physics. Very interesting disciplines to study with relationship to the religion and science interface, because biology has had a lot of present conflict and debate with particular religious communities over different kinds of scientific discoveries and assertions. Physics does not have as much debate with religious communities in the modern era, but definitely did historically. And so these two disciplines have very different relationships to the science and religion interface. In addition, biology does quite a bit better in terms of parity of men and women in science. There's still not equal representation, but it does a good deal better than physics. I'm actually giving a talk in the physics department tomorrow about diversity in science for any of you who are interested in that. And so we also know that in the general public that women are much more likely to be religious than men, and that's true in almost all societies. And so given that, biology and physics make some difference and make some sense to study as comparative disciplines because of gender representation and that connection to religiosity as well. So when I am studying religious people, one of the things that comes up most often when I ask them what they think about science and the impact that science will have on faith, particularly those who are more traditionally religious, those who are evangelical Christians, those who are traditional Catholics, and those who are Muslims, there's a very common narrative that practicing science or taking science classes will take children in faith communities away from their faith. That is a very dominant narrative in some communities. And so then it becomes interesting to me as a social scientist what really has happened in the life trajectories of scientists. So how do scientists understand in their own terms the intersection of scientific training, their own scientific training, with their own faith trajectory? So, like a good social scientist, I asked them. And we found resoundingly, and this is not just in this study, but over several studies on this topic that my team and I have conducted, that most atheist scientists in their own terms do not see themselves as being atheists because of science. There is a strong minority who do, but most do not because of science. So this is one of many survey questions we asked. So I put the stem of the survey question there. Would you say that your scientific training, knowledge and training has had no effect on how religious you are? So the majority say that in both the US and UK, more so in the UK than US, that their scientific training has had no effect on how religious they are. And this is just among the atheist scientists, those who we might most expect their scientific training to have an effect on how they're religious we are, if any group was going to. Made you become slightly less religious, so hovering a little over 10% there, about 12% for both of the national contexts, and made you become much less religious. So you do see there that there is a strong minority who say that it made them become much less religious, but the majority say that it has no effect on how religious they are. So here is, I want to be truth in advertising here. Here is a quote from a scientist who said that they did transition away from religion because of science. So this is a physicist actually, who says, I was just trying to accommodate my naive religious views of the time with what I was learning from science. And I saw that actually the two things don't go together very well. It's not just about the notions, it's about the methodology, that in religion you should have faith without any proof of it, essentially, while science, it's just the opposite, You shouldn't believe in things without evidence. So that was definitely there in the data. But more common was for scientists to tell us that they had had bad experiences with religion. And this is something I stress a lot when I am actually giving talks about this material to faith communities, which I do often. I would say my two main outreach groups are to scientists themselves and to faith communities and faith leaders. That's where I share my data most, in addition to the academic work that I do. This quote really touches me, and I think it's one that faith leaders really need to pay attention to, also from a physicist in the U.S. who said that for him, it probably made him a little bit antagonistic to religion because I was told I was going to hell when I was a kid by a classmate because we didn't go to church. So for this particular scientist, there is this sense that religion is a very negative thing. And in addition to this kind of narrative, there is also the narrative that scientists had bad experiences with religion when they were religious. So it's actually in the US in particular, it's very uncommon for an atheist scientist to have been raised in an atheist home. So the increase in the proportion of atheists in American society is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. So most people who are atheists now were actually not raised in atheist homes. There's not very many people who are what I would call second generation atheists. And so these folks mostly went away from religion in some pathway, and often they went away from American evangelicalism or American Catholicism. Those would be the two dominant traditions that people would have been raised in and then end up as atheist scientists. I want to talk to you now a little bit about a group that one of my respondents called. I love talking to scientists because they're very, very bright people, right? And it's just sort of a little anecdote about what it's like to do research with scientists. So I've done research with lots of different kinds of social groups, immigrants, different racial groups, different ethnic groups, lots of different religious groups. But scientists, I'm sure, as some of you know, are in a special class by themselves. And in the following, that scientists will really contradict you as the researcher. So with my other groups of people, very rarely am I asking them interview questions, and they say, I don't like that question. You know, here's the kind of question I really think you should be asking me. So they will tell you how to do your own research. So they definitely feel it's a very empowered group of people. And so they will tell you what to do. And I've gotten very used to that. I have very thick skin in terms of people contradicting me. I'm just waiting for the kind of questions you're going to ask me after I said that. But what has been really fun about interviewing scientists, and I always say, like, I love scientists so much. I married one. My husband's a particle physicist, so I'm very committed to scientists, but is just that they are really in dialogue with you about your actual research findings, and I think that's a whole lot of fun. So these categories are very much created by my respondents. Like, they told me what their social group is, and I took note and then followed it up in further study, but that was really fun to kind of really be studying a group of people who's in so much dialogue with you. I really enjoy that. So this first group that I want to talk about of atheists are what I call modernist atheist scientists. And these are folks who are very disconnected to religion. So they think that science is the only way of knowing, and that anything that can be discovered through scientific method is not really worth being involved with. These are folks who, when asked on a survey if they've been in a religious organization in the past year, have not even been in a religious organization for a wedding or a funeral, still two rites of passage that almost always take place in religious organizations. So these folks do not have a religious spouse, do not part of a religious organization, would never send their children to a religious school, are very much committed to not being part of institutional religion in any way, and do not think of themselves as spiritual to any extent. So these folks are still, and so just put it down here, they do not believe in God, have no formal or informal engagement with religion or spirituality. This is the majority of atheist scientists. So those who categorize as modernist atheist scientists are 66% in the US and 74% in the UK. When we look at the conflict between religion and science for atheist scientists, we see that this is the group also who is likely to consider there to be a conflict between religion and science and consider themselves to be on the side of science. We broke up these categories to be quite varied, so there were different ranges of conflict. You can consider yourself to have them be in conflict, but be on the side of religion. That almost never happens in the scientific community. If folks think that there is a conflict between religion and science, understandably, they're on the side of science. the independence that they refer to different aspects of reality. There is a significant minority of modernist atheist scientists who think that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality, or collaboration that each can be used to support the other, and that's a very small proportion of modernist atheist scientists. So when we look at the reasons that modernist atheist scientists give for seeing themselves as wanting to be completely and totally disconnected from religion, it's mainly this, that religion is a problem for science. This is the modal response. So a biologist in the UK says this: when I think about religion, I apply my scientific methodology, and the most I can make of it is that it is mass psychosis or neurotic behavior by inadequate personalities. What do you really think? So, I mean, yeah, very, very straightforward. There is a group of atheist scientists, though, also a significant minority, so this is less common but still present in my data, who even though, and I think this is very interesting because we would expect these folks to be the most negative about religion, and there's still a significant group of them who are not negative about religion, who think that religion can have a positive societal role. So here's a UK biologist who says, religion can motivate people into doing charitable work. You see people doing good things, helping the homeless, things like that. Very often it is religious people who are motivated to do that. And this perhaps is one of my favorite findings to some extent, is that the group of scientists who think of themselves as new atheists, who some see as being led by Richard Dawkins, and his writings have had obviously a huge impact, they are often, the modernist atheist scientists I studied often want to set themselves apart from the new atheists, want to say, you know, those folks, those writings do not represent me. So I remember interviewing an atheist scientist at a well-known university, okay, it was Oxford, who said to me, you know, I wonder, you know, it's so interesting you're doing this work on what scientists think about religion. It's so fun to talk to you. But he said, really, you should be talking to Richard. And I'm like, Richard? So obviously he knows him on a first name basis. He meant Richard Dawkins. And then he went on to say, but I'm not like Richard. And that was such an interesting statement. And again, not wanting to distance themselves from the very positive public work that Richard Dawkins has done, trying to translate science to the broader public, but wanting to really distance himself from the kind of particular attitudes towards religion and religious people that Richard Dawkins and colleagues have written so actively about. So, and that phrase, I'm an atheist scientist, but I'm not like Richard, actually, and this is so fun to do these kind of qualitative data analysis, came up over and over in the data. So this very active desire to set a boundary between themselves and new atheist scientists, which this group of atheist scientists feels is not doing any favor to public science, and does not represent them and does not represent their attitudes towards the public. So here's a particular quote from a UK biologist who says about Richard Dawkins, he's a fundamental atheist. He feels compelled to take the evidence way beyond that which other scientists would regard as possible. And I want students to develop science in their own lives, and I think it's necessary to understand what science does address directly, and he meant by inference, and does not address directly. The next category are scientists who see themselves as culturally religious. And I do think this is a very interesting category and has a lot of potential for increasing dialogue between atheist scientists and members of religious communities. Because some atheist scientists are actually part of those religious communities, are personally part of religious communities in significant ways. So the definition of this category is those who do not believe in God or identify as spiritual, but have evidence of more than one of these behaviors, say that they pray, say that they do actually part of religious service attendance to some extent, have a religious spouse or partner, have their child attend a religious school. So we classified these folks as cultural or religious if they have multiple of these behaviors. And again, this is a category that respondents kind of sometimes use to describe themselves, that I'm culturally religious. I think religion is significant, but I'm not an actual believer. I'm an atheist. So this is, in the US, 28% of the atheist scientists, and the UK, 21%. When we look at the frequency of responses to the conflict question, again, this is, for me personally, my understanding of the science and religion relationship can be described as, we see that in the UK, there's 47%, compared to the US, 44%. See themselves as having a conflict, see there as being a conflict between religion and science, so that actually goes down significantly from the modern atheist scientists. The greater group here have the independence perspective. They think that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality. And then a small minority, the 4% in both nations, have the collaboration perspective that each can be used supports the other. So here's what UK and US atheist scientists say in their own words about what it means to be culturally atheist, culturally religious atheists. So part of this is a sense of belonging without belief. So wanting very much to stay a part of religious communities, stay connected to that sense of community, especially for UK atheist scientists where there's much more a sense of symbolic religiosity and a sense of it being okay to be part of a community without actually believing. They want to have that kind of connection to a community without connecting to the actual ideas or theological sensibilities of religion. So here's a UK physicist who says this: practice is important, I guess, for me. It reminds me of the history of a particular group of people that I have some connection to. And a UK biologist says, I love this quote, "I enjoy going to church for the suspension of disbelief, for the theatrical experience, for reading, for the liturgy, for the magnificent stories, which is intensely spiritual. That's a real experience. But what I don't get, what I found myself just unable to reach, was the communion with the deity." Another thing that came up often in these data is the belief among these atheist scientists who are culturally religious that there is a sense where religion can provide very valuable educational experiences for children. So a UK biologist said about his children being in a religious school, they had to go to church services, they had to pray in the assembly and all of these kinds of things. That kind of ground against us a bit, but they're getting otherwise a good education, and the amount of irritation we get out of this is not dreadful. That is such a UK way to say something. Sorry. Love my colleagues there. A UK physicist said, "I am kind of an interested observer when talking about being married to a religious spouse. My wife would call herself a Christian. I wouldn't, but I enjoy what I hear there, and I find much of it very helpful, but I honestly couldn't call myself a Christian." There is also this group of atheist scientists who call themselves spiritual atheists. And I could tell you stories about how hard it has been to get this material past reviewers in the publication process, that we have gotten a ton of pushback on this category. So as a social scientist, I don't make commentary on whether or not I agree with categories or don't agree with categories, but this is how scientists describe things in their own terms. So there is a group of them who see themselves as being spiritual atheists. But reviewers in sociology get very angry by this term. They think of it as being very inconsistent, which is interesting because that's not really our job as sociologists to make commentary on whether or not people's lives are consistent. But they're mostly not. I just did it. So, but there is the sense where for some reason this category, makes certain types of people angry, and I just think that's super fascinating. So, spiritual atheists would be those who do not believe in God or in an impersonal or transcendent higher power of any kind, but nevertheless identify as spiritual but not religious, that spirituality is meaningful to them, They see something, there being something outside themselves that calls them to a higher moral good, but they do not see themselves as religious in any way or connect that in any way to God, and they see themselves also as atheists. Very different than those in the general public who do not see themselves as convinced atheists. So they're spiritual but not religious people in the general public. This is quite a popular category, but most of them are not atheists. This is a small group at less than 10% in the US and UK, but it's a very interesting group. These folks are very unlikely to see themselves as having a conflict between religion and science, especially in the UK. They are much more likely to see science and religion as being independent, as referring to different aspects of reality. And there's a small proportion in the UK at 7% who think that science and religion can even collaborate with one another. The spiritual atheists in our sample often connect their sense of spirituality to nature. So here's a US biologist who said, personally, I believe in nature and I get my spirituality from being in nature, but I don't believe there's a God, so I don't consider it necessary for what I do or how I behave. The other thing that came out in this group, more so than in the other two categories, the modernists and the culturally religious atheist scientists, is this idea of awe and wonder. Here is a UK biologist who says that I think my definition of spirituality is fairly nebulous. I'm not doing my work to cure a disease or do something that will fan a startup company. That's interesting. I suppose the goal of my work is service to humanity, to impart a sense of wonder. And so that's all part of my worldview that encompasses spirituality as well. This group of scientists, the spiritual atheist scientists, also were the most likely to see limits on what science can explain. Here's a UK physicist who said, there's only so far, I like this quote so much, if you're a complete human being that you can be objective about the world. There's this feeling about yourself and your existence, and on that level, neurology, physics, it doesn't remotely explain the sense of being. And to me, that is what I would call spiritualism and what I would say science can't explain. And the spiritual atheist scientists were also the only group to talk robustly about linking their sensibility, their spirituality, their spiritual atheism to actions. So this group were more likely to talk about, mentoring their students. They saw themselves as distinctive from other types of atheist scientists and other types of scientists, for example. So here's a US biologist who said, I believe that nature is the mother of everything and we belong to nature. I think we're extremely connected to nature. And I try to focus my job, my work on getting to know Mother Nature, not only to protect it, but also kind of restore it or bring it back to better conditions than we had before. So I feel a really kind of totally personal connection, a spiritual connection with nature, and that kind of motivates a lot of my work. Lastly, I want to talk for a few minutes about the reasons that I think religious people should give atheist scientists a chance, in part for the sake of public science. So it's definitely the case that scientists have a lot of stereotypes that are inaccurate about religious people. Some of my work has studied that pretty robustly. But religious people also have pretty strong and entrenched stereotypes and accurate stereotypes of who scientists are as well, and in particular who atheist scientists are. I've talked some about that with colleagues, with our several colleagues in the book Secularity and Science. But in that book, we show that scientists are more religious than most people think, and that most scientists do not view the relationship between religion and science as one of conflict. And in our new book, The Varieties of Atheism in Science, we show that even atheist scientists, even the modernist atheist scientists, those that we might expect, if any group is, to be most hostile to religion, often are not hostile to religion. And that atheist scientists experience a sense of awe and wonder in the natural world, which in some ways is a similar sensibility to what many religious people experience in the awe with relationship to the natural world, that sense of awe and wonder that they attribute as coming from a God. Scientists who are atheists sometimes experience that as well, but not disconnected, but very much disconnected from God or a connection to God, but still that larger sense of awe and wonder is sometimes explained in very similar ways. And so in the end of our book, we talk about the ways in which religious people, and Christians in particular, some of whom who have come out very negatively against atheist scientists, ought to also do more to explore the world of atheist scientists, to more thoughtfully and truthfully understand who atheist scientists are. And when breaking down the stereotypes between these two groups might be part of the way forward for more productive dialogue towards the common goal of the common good. Thank you so much. I think I'll end there and really look forward to your questions and our guided dialogue now.
Thank you, Elaine. We have a good amount of time for questions. Just some ground rules. When you ask a question, please say your name. Please keep the question short, and please keep it in the form of a question. And that'll let us have a number of people be able to ask questions. I thought I would start to give everyone just a minute to prime what they want to ask. But after that, raise your hand. I'll make my way around, and we'll try to get to as many people as we can. Elaine, I wondered about, you talked about the age demographics, and I wondered if you saw any differences between, say, younger scientists and the types of atheism they expressed versus older cohorts of scientists.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to talk about it in this particular talk, but we put it in the book. So the spiritual atheism is much more likely to show up among younger scientists. And while there's still a larger, this is kind of, I'm trying to think of how to explain this simply. So modernist atheist scientists trend a little bit older.
Thank you. Questions? Oh, many questions. All right, we'll start over here.
My name is Janelle Allen. Would you please describe for us the new atheists? Some of us don't know about them either.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So this is a group of scientists, really just a collection of scientists who tend to see themselves as coming out pretty negatively against religion and religious people, seeing religion as being very harmful to science. I mean, I certainly think under certain conditions it could be, and have written very actively about that and think that it's very inconsistent to be a scientist and be a religious person, and would like to, in some of their writings, really see religion eradicated for the safety of society. So the ones who kind of call themselves, they called themselves popularly the Four Horsemen of Atheism, you know, are Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and the late philosopher Christopher Hitchens.
Hi, I'm John Fotenhauer. Question I had was whether you could explain or unpack a little bit more how the modernist atheists distinguished themselves from the new atheists. You said, I'm not like Richard. In what way are they not like Richard?
So they take great pains to not be dismissive of religious people. So and I think some of them in their narratives do this very genuinely, like they really do think religion potentially has some good to offer society, especially if it motivates good acts in society, humanitarian acts. That some of the quote material I put up said that. Some of them don't want to be dismissive of religion for very functional purposes. They know that there are a lot of religious people out there, that they control funding for science, and so they think it really doesn't work well for science if atheist scientists come out so strongly against religion and religious people. So that also came up as a narrative. But whether it's for, you know, I have these genuine notions that religion can do good in society, or I just think functionally this is not going to work out well for us because we need religious people on board to get more funding and advance science, still there is a considerable sense of being more positive or nuanced in approach to religious people than we might be led to believe when we read books like Religion in an Age of Reason or The God Delusion or other books of that sort. That's not the most common view, yeah.
I'm Bassam Shakashiri. I especially like your call for talking and allowing others
Yeah,
to
thank
be
you.
engaged in respectful conversations. My question is about not only about the methodologies that you have used. It's a question I ask you and ask everyone else in the audience. Have you, in your studies, asked the participants, what is science and what is religion? I'm not a reductionist in any way. I'm seeking clarity about what it is that we are really talking about. So, you know, people say, I'm on the side of science, or science won the election last, you know, science was not on the ballot. But, my question is, do the participants, do we engage them in saying what they think science is and what they think religion is?
Yeah, so our team has written several papers about those topics. And so scientists, I would say almost colloquially, discuss science as being in what we might think of as a very, very much connected to the set of tools that science uses to understand the natural world. So we're going to make, scientists very commonly talk about this. Everyday people in the general public don't talk about science this way, but scientists talk about scientific work in terms of making theories about how the natural or biological world works that generate testable empirical hypotheses. Like, that's an extremely common narrative for scientists to talk about. Everyday people talk about science as being about reason broadly, or you know, scientists and what they think about society and people and the structures of science. And so they talk much more about all the cultural aspects of science. Scientists themselves have almost a purist understanding of what science is and what science isn't. Religion is understood, interestingly, in similar ways by both groups of people, by both general public people and scientists, as being about core religious traditions and the particular kind of philosophic and theological presuppositions of particular religious traditions, and not very much about the cultural edifice of religion, you know, what religion does in society, or its connection to politics, or these kinds of things. Like, neither scientists or everyday people have very much nuanced understanding about the breadth of religion and how it functions in society.
My question also aims at the point of clarity in what you're presenting, and I think to get at clarity, terminology is important. And I'm concerned about the terms modernist, atheist, and new atheists. They're quite different, you explained, but why those terms, modernist and new? Because they sound kind of similar, modernist and new. I mean, if you would say, like, absolute atheists or fundamental atheists, instead of new, but why did you choose those terms rather than some other terms to describe those categories of atheists?
Those are good questions. Those are questions that, I don't know what your discipline is, that a philosopher might ask. A sociologist asks a different set of questions. So we're trying to understand the largest categories that people use to describe themselves. And so new atheism has been used to describe a group of people that call themselves the new atheists, that write about new atheism. And this modernist atheist category is a group that my respondents used in a much more fluid way and expansive way when compared to what they thought was a fairly narrow category of new atheism. So these are all self-described categories.
But is there a time marker? Maybe this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a time marker between new and modern?
No, I don't think that's the right way to understand it. So it would rather be better to think about it as a diversity of perspectives within current times rather than a time marker. So both of these ideas, or social groups is another way to think about it, are operating at the same time. This fellow in the way back who's getting up just now, you had your hand up for quite a while. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yep. And then maybe you.
Is this on? Yep.
Yeah.
Gordy Sussman. My question concerns the category of the culturally religious atheists,
Yeah.
either by data or by empirical opinion and observation. Can you parse out what percentages approximately would be out of mainline Christian tradition, evangelical tradition, or Jewish or otherwise? Which groups are they rubbing elbows with without diving in?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. So, most Christianity in the UK is Anglican. I mean, there is the Scottish church as well, but we didn't have very many scientists who were from Scotland in this particular study. And then to a lesser extent, there certainly are evangelical Anglicans, so that is a present, and there was a responsiveness to that particular category. And in the U.S., it tended to be conservative Jews and Catholics and evangelicals, and to a lesser extent, mainline Christians. Yeah.
Hi, Mark Germain. I think you probably gave this at first, but I can't remember. I'm interested in the percentage of scientists who have some religious belief as opposed to those who don't.
So in the U.S., when you pool together all categories of religion across both, at this point, our team has studied all fields of biology, physics, and chemistry. And then we've done some other studies on social scientists, which is maybe a different talk, but that it's a little bit less than 50%.
My name's Andrew, and this gentleman largely, sorry about that. This gentleman largely answered asked my question, but
Yeah.
to kind of follow through on it is that one thing I've noticed is that when people use the word religion, they really mean Christianity, and they kind of say all religions are Christianity, and I was curious if that, just curious if that came into play at all, if that was still like when people talked about religion, were they talking mostly about Christianity, or were they talking about all religions?
So this was actually a really fun part in my whole research program and our team of having studied religion among scientists in 8 different national contexts. So there are different major religions in the 8 national contexts we studied. And so what is consistent across these different countries is that when people say religion, they mean the dominant religion of their country. And we actually kept using that word. It had a lot of traction. I thought that I would want to get rid of that word in surveys because people wouldn't know what it means, and there'd be all these nuanced understandings across different national contexts. And actually, it was a great word. Everyone has the same understanding of what religion is for their particular national context. So the word and what it means to be very religious or not very religious. So it ended up being a super great word, even though I wanted some better words, some more nuanced words. But so in the U.S., you're exactly right. People are usually talking about Christianity because that is the set of Christian traditions are by far the largest in the U.S. All other religious traditions make up less than 6% of religious people in the U.S. So while certain religious traditions like Judaism and Islam in particular do get a lot of press and are certainly very present, they are far the minority traditions compared to Christianity. Interestingly, if you ask, another piece of your question may be, what kind of religious traditions do scientists think of as a problem for science or things like that? In the U.S., it's definitely evangelical Christianity. So scientists think of evangelical Christianity as being the religious tradition that's most a problem for science. In the UK, it's definitely Islam. Definitely Islam. You'd think there were tons of Muslims in the UK, given how much scientists talk about Islam and its potential for having a negative impact on science. I think it is. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is John, and my question has to do with the history of atheism. So was there ever a time where...
I hope there's someone in this room who knows about that. That's not, I'm not a historian, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, was there ever a time where atheism was just a single category, or has, have all these categories existed, simultaneously? If the former were true, at what point in history did sociologists begin to notice this morphing and, branching out into modern and new atheism and all the like?
Yeah, you're lucky, because I was just on a conversation with the historian of religion, Lee Schmidt, this morning about this topic. This is like never happens. I didn't make this up. But he wrote this book called The Village Atheist, which you might read if you're interested in that particular topic. So the way we discuss atheism now as a kind of acceptable social category is a relatively recent phenomenon, according to Schmidt. That's why he calls it the village atheist, because it used to be like the village witch or something, like kind of this really aberrant category. And so even the idea that we would think about like, oh, there are like nuances in atheism, and Lee Schmidt and some other historians have coined that phrase, this much maligned minority, right? Meaning that atheists are used as the other category in contradistinction from religious people. So the bad and the good, right? So this like a distinctive other categorying. So there is significantly more acceptance of atheism and openness to studying its varieties in our current time period than there has been. Now, I am not a historian, so I would not hazard a guess as to the distinct period when that, you need to talk with someone who has different kinds of tools and skills than I do, but there definitely is research on that area. That's a great question.
Hi.
I keep wanting to choose the people, but you choose the people, so I need to stop looking at them. Great.
Colin Hoffman. So,
I'm.
oh, sorry.
Okay.
So my question is around the spiritual atheists.
Yeah.
So I've observed that in like Asian societies, people who are Buddhist and Taoist don't consider themselves religious, but they consider themselves spiritual, even though we would consider them religious because they are practicing Buddhist or Taoist. I'm wondering how many of the people in that spiritual atheist category fit into that category. And then also I'm wondering, especially you said the younger generation is falling a lot into the spiritual atheist category. How many of those people, have you asked any of them, like how many of them are just atheists who've been experimenting with psychedelics or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, those are nuanced questions which deserve a nuanced answer. I do know something about the first question. So this talk dealt with atheists in the US and the UK and spiritual atheists in the US and UK. In both of those national contexts, spirituality is a word that has a consistent cluster of meanings. When we start to go, I've also studied the science community in Hong Kong and Taiwan and India. And so when we start to go to those other national and regional contexts, there is not a distinctive cluster of concepts that gel around spirituality in the same way that we might understand it in the US or the UK, as being maybe a kind of a sensibility that draws from various religious traditions, that is much individualized, that is about something larger than the self, which usually is not attached to a community of practice. So those kinds of concepts are not really resonant in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I would say religion actually has a more consistent meaning in those nations, and spirituality doesn't have a consistent meaning. So it's almost the exact opposite. I don't know how to answer the second piece of your question about what the spirituality is really about for this younger group of scientists, whether it's I don't know, about a psychedelic or mystical experience or something like that. I don't know that I really have data on that.
Yeah, quick follow-up. Just my experience with young people is that, religions that we would consider Buddhism and Taoism are really on the rise in young people. So I'm wondering, if you guys have considered adding those types of questions, especially for the younger audience who might consider themselves practicing in those communities and therefore being spiritual but not religious.
So in the U.S., definitely there is more talk of Buddhist meditation practices, but often very disconnected from the religious traditions that we would think of as Buddhism. So scholars of religion sometimes say it's, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, sort of Buddhism light. They're Buddhist-like practices that are very disconnected from any historic tradition of Buddhism and with very little knowledge of a historic tradition, but definitely called Buddhist practices, and from a sort of U.S. standpoint. This does not happen as much in the UK. It's not connected in the same way. Spirituality is not. So this seems to be, some scholars are attaching this to the American sense of individualism. Like there is a kind of empowerment religiously in the U.S. where people feel that they can pick and choose pieces of different kinds of traditions to make their own thing. Robert Bella had coined this, decades and decades ago when, this famous interview respondent, he's a famous sociologist of religion who passed away several years ago, who was at Berkeley for many years, who interviewed this famous woman called Sheila, as some of you may have heard of this, called Sheilaism, and she said, my religion and spirituality is the religion of Sheila. Her name was Sheila. It's just my own little voice. And so Bella used that to say that, in the U.S., people have this like real religious individualism. I don't totally agree with Bella on that. I don't think we're ever completely disconnected from community. I think to be human is to be social. So I do think there are communities of practice around spiritual sensibilities, and that's really shows up in sociological work, but it's not kind of attached to a cohesive tradition. Like even though you might take bits and pieces of Buddhism and your friends might also do that and you form a community, it's not, say, connected deeply to Theravada Buddhism versus Mahayana Buddhism, for example. There's a lot of, if you're interested in this, I can point you to lots of books. There's a lot written about that, yeah.
I'm Ned Hale. This is a question about some of us in the religious community have become very aware lately of some prominent scientists like Francis Collins in the United States, or reading books by Alistair McGrath in the UK, who are trying very much to bring science and religion together. And I'm wondering, my question is, well, apart from the history of science, where so many prominent scientists were ardent Christians, they could be easily dismissed perhaps because they're so ancient. But these are modern people, and the media has now become a way of their becoming more popularized in their knowledge of their faith being shared. So I'm wondering, are any of the people you've interviewed even in touch with some of the things that have been said by these people?
So I have done a study where our team did these interviews with scientists and then analyzed the data to for mention of prominent authors. So one of the questions we asked are there books that you read? Are there thinkers that you refer to about the religion and science interface? Richard Dawkins is by far the most popular. Like Francis Collins doesn't even hold a close second. He is second, but by very far away in terms of recognition. So most scientists, even across international contexts, so like Indian scientists, for example, have heard of Richard Dawkins, are kind of loosely aware of this cultural ideal. So interestingly, so that's one kind of piece of evidence, and do with that what you will. We did another study where we did a little, what's called a social psychological experiment. So this is among everyday people. We had a vignette about Richard Dawkins and a vignette about Francis Collins. So we're like, there's this scientist, he's named this, and here's what he does, and here's the book he's written. This is totally true for both of them. Again, do with this what you will. most people in the general public haven't heard of either Richard Dawkins or Francis Collins. Okay, very low proportion have heard of either one of us. So we're among the elite to know of both of them, right? And so, I'm thinking about my grandmother right now, who didn't go to college, and I kept getting more and more education, and she said to me once, I said, I can't believe people think X, and she said, she always called me by my full name, Elaine Marie. She would say, Elaine Marie, you need to understand, you are not typical. That's a very wise phrase. I think about that every now and then. So we're not typical. But what was interesting from this social psychological experiment is that when we introduced people who didn't know of either with information, is that when we introduced them with information about Francis Collins, they were more likely to take a collaboration perspective between religion and science, which was super interesting. So that seemed to kind of work a little bit in a kind of small way. But they thought that Richard Dawkins was a more typical scientist. So another set of questions we asked, like which of these people, and we randomized it and all these for those of you who are social psychologists to try to do the study in a good way. And they thought Richard Dawkins was a much more typical scientist, like they thought most scientists are like Richard Dawkins. But Francis Collins was more effective in convincing them that science and religion could collaborate. That was all.
I have a question. So over to your left, over here.
Oh, sorry. Well,
no
we've
worries.
got like more
Voice,
than one microphone
voice all
going
over
now.
the place.
You're just trying to like play jokes on me now. Yeah.
No, my name's Ethan Parrish, and I hope you can forgive me for asking a question outside of your presented convinced atheists data set. But you presented data on effectively interrogating to what degree science has negatively impacted religiosity.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in if you've asked the flip side of that coin, to what
Yeah.
degree science has positively impacted religiosity.
So there is a small group of people for whom I may actually, well, it's quite a small group of people, so less than 15% based on different contexts and disciplines. But there is a small group of people for whom science has made them more religious. And those narratives are deeply around the wonder and awe and those kind of things, yeah. Oh.
Hello, my
Peter?
name is Peter Sobel, and I think it was your fifth point where you said that religious people should give atheist scientists a chance. What do you mean by that?
So I don't know exactly how to put this into practice, so I want to be transparent. It's something I'm toying with, but most religious people or most religious communities, and I worked with a lot of different kinds of communities, especially Christian communities, would not think of inviting atheist scientists to give talks in a religious setting or being in a dialogue group with atheist scientists. They have very and I have studied this, they have very entrenched and negative stereotypes about atheist scientists. So when I said give a chance, if I were giving this, in a church community, for example, rather than a community where there's like probably a diverse set of views present in this audience, I might say it a little bit differently. So increasingly, Christian groups in particular are doing dialogues around issues of faith and science. They're having in speakers some communities. And so to consider the possibility of being in dialogue with atheist scientists may break down some of the stereotypes that, say, children and other young people and members of these communities might have. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking about.
Hi, my name is Holly Blada. So I think early on in your talk, you said something about how some of your findings surprised you. What was like your most surprising finding, and why did it surprise you?
So this whole project was very much an inductive project. So other projects that our team has done, very much based on existing data, and we had very particular kind of hypotheses that we were assessing and things like that. So this project is a bit different in terms of the empirical process in that we were already involved in these other big data collections, and we started noticing these different types of atheist scientists and having scientists themselves start talking to us about different categories. And then we began to, then we intervened in our study and, did a study, going forward on these, like, oh, this is happening in a little way. Let's see if this category actually maps out as we consider going forward in the study. So that was very surprising. I mean, so surprising to our team, not just me, that we, embedded a second study within our larger study just looking at atheist scientists. And I would say secondarily, I was very surprised that this modernist atheist scientist group, which is, I think the terminology of which is just satisfactory in some ways to some, and the audience understandably so, was under certain conditions so positive to religion and religious people and thought religion could be a cultural good. That was very surprising to me. That was not, that my stereotype was different. Yes.
I am, my name's Bruce Wells, and I'm going to kind of set this up in three parts of how I'm doing this. So we have science. We've got atheists and we have religious people and all kinds of different people, but they're doing science. And they're doing science on something that's existing here and now that came from the past. Atheists see it, well, people who believe in God, that God created, see it as an eternal God created it, and now with science we're discovering everything that God did. And atheists believe it just happened. And somehow, in my mind, they have to believe, if they think about it, to me, if they think about it, that it came from eternity past, because if there used to be in some point in the past absolute pure nothing, then we'd still have absolutely pure nothing. Because if something could come out of it, then there was something there, not absolute pure nothing. So both believe from eternity past we have what we have now, doing science on it. Then what they're discovering, to me now it seems like the atheist and the believer, what the conflict comes in on who's controlling a narrative of where it came from, why it's here, what it means. And I guess I'm thinking, is that how you see it too? Like that's how it's getting framed up, why there's a conflict between the two sides?
Yeah, oh, that's a really sensitive question. I really like that. So philosophers, historians, theologians, I think I said historians, would argue that these things are matters of ideas, right? So there are, science is a set of ideas, religion is a set of ideas, and so the work of philosophers and historians and theologians to some extent has been about trying to understand how these sets of ideas interface with one another. So social scientists and sociologists, I think, are more interested in the kind of question you're asking, like who has power in this relationship and what sets of actors have power and who, I like the way you said, frames up the narrative. Like that's the way the person who gets to decide the terms of the debate, right, has the power in the debate. Like, I decide the survey questions, right? So, you have only this range of 3 answers, I said. so that's, I think thinking about how the kind of power structures in society decide the terms of the debate is the kind of thing that I'm very interested in as a sociologist, and how we might examine that a little bit towards the aim of leading to healthier dialogue and debate, I think is a very worthy intellectual goal. Yeah.
Because they're supposed to be doing science on the same exact thing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to think about it. Yeah, I agree with you.
Hi, my name is Doug Fearing, and you might have just kind of answered my question in one of your last comments there, but millions of dollars are being spent on your research. Like you got a $2.9 million grant. What's the end game? I mean, what's your hope in all of this for all of this research to actually be done, other than you've got a career out of it? I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but what are we going to get out of this?
Yeah, should all academics be asked such an upfront question, right? Yeah, we all got to be wrestling. We ought to be wrestling with that question. So I am extremely passionate about translating and engaging with the public. So I probably spend almost 50% of my time trying to be involved in some kind of engagement effort with the broader public, and a lot of my free time that's not actual my work time. So I don't think I see it as something of a calling. I do not think that all academics, you're asking a larger question about like what's the good of universities, what's the good of research, and these, really your question is about like larger projects of knowledge making, which all of us should be asking ourselves. So I think academics like me who do research that very obviously relates to public concerns probably have a lot more moral responsibility to make sure that they translate their work well to the public, that they take, what the sentiments of everyday people are into consideration about the kinds of projects that they're doing, and they work very, very hard to get this work into the hands of people who could really use it well, and try to even use the research to figure out what kind of tools are most useful to using the research well. So that's kind of what, I could talk to you for hours about this. I also think there's enormous value in, mentoring and employing people. I've worked with about 200 people on my studies, for example. So those kind of things are of value too. Is that the kind of question you're asking? Or you had something else in mind?
I think you tried to make it a lot bigger
than what you were thinking? You were thinking much smaller?
I was specifically asking, how is this gonna, so I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
And I'm actually asking myself, why am I here?
Yeah.
And other than your one comment that Christians should give atheists, scientists, a chance, which I agree. Ultimately, if your number one goal is absolute truth, it shouldn't matter if you're an atheist or a Christian, because you're after truth. Mm-hmm. And I always love the proverb that says it's to the glory of God to conceal a matter. It's to the glory of kings to search it out. And that's what I think science is it's searching out the things that God's kept secret, and we're just constantly amazed by what we find. So I love science. I'm all for science, and I'm not afraid of science as a Christian. But I'm like, okay, so other than to get atheists and Christians to talk, is that your goal? Or is there some other goal?
Yeah. No, I think that's one of the goals. The other thing that our team has been very concerned about is trying to use the data to remove impediments that certain Christian groups might have to science. So sometimes Christian groups, and I think this is especially, now I'm talking out of my own moral sensibility as someone who shares your faith framework, that I think it's very sad when groups that are quite marginalized, so this is especially true in African American communities and to a lesser extent, but also extent in Hispanic communities, are being told that science and religion are in conflict, and then are experiencing what is almost a double marginalization in science, that they feel kept out of science because of both their racial or ethnic location and because of their religious location. So our team has done a lot of outreach recently into particular communities of color that are Christians to try to bring scientists. So one thing that our research has discovered is that it's very effective if a scientist shares both a faith location and a racial location, to go into that particular community that shares their race and their faith, and then bring their scientific perspective. It is extraordinarily effective in breaking down any kind of perception of a conflict between religion and science, and in some cases actually makes children, for example, in those communities feel like they too have access to science and scientific careers, and I think we need more of those folks in science. So that's been, that's not the only reason I do the research, but that's been very satisfying to see the way in which the research has had that very real and practical and I think beneficial impact. Good question.
Yeah, my name is Ken Seitzma, and one word that I didn't hear was agnostic. So in my department, for example, and I think some of the other biology departments, there are clear, I know of atheists, I know of religious faculty, but I would say a big chunk of them are what I would call agnostic, that Huxley kind of defined after Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. That is, we don't have evidence one way or the other, so not being an atheist or being religious. So did you include those people, and did they get included in the atheist camp, or did you just disregard that?
So they are not included in this particular study of atheists. There are certainly lots of agnostics in science. So actually that's a very popular category, and there are many more agnostics in science than in the general public. And agnostics are a wonderfully complicated category, because scientists are a people group in the whole population of professional groups who prize consistency to a very great extent. So everyday people, as I quipped before, and I'll say again, do not prize consistency that much. So it's not as high a value as it is for scientists. And so then with scientists, you see folks who would never say that they are certain that they think anything. So this is right, because you have more or less evidence in favor of hypotheses you never fully know. I mean, science is inherently humble, right? So there is, I love that about it to some extent. So there is a sense where we find both people who are very close to highly religious people who also call themselves agnostics. So scientists who call themselves agnostics and also attend church once a week and pray every day, and scientists who are agnostics who are really more like atheists functionally in terms of their practice and things, are more like these modernist atheists that I talked about. So with agnosticism, there's a whole range from what looks more like religious to what looks more like atheist.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine.
I don't know if that's the note to end on or not, but okay.
Well, we're going to end the Q&A there.
Yeah.
Elaine will be up here if you want to come up and talk to her right after we finish here. Just a couple notes before we give Elaine a final round of applause. The book is on sale right over here. Jack is selling it for $10, so head on over there. And also AJB, the espresso station over here. If you're the type of person that wants a latte at 8:30 at night, we got you covered over here. With that, thank you for coming tonight. Let's give Elaine one more round of applause.
Thank you.
Have a good night and go in peace.